Welcome, welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. I'm Alexander Gendler. As a part of what we do, we interview from time to time leading thinkers on the topics that we consider to be of importance to the Jewish people. Today, we welcome Professor Emeritus of University of California at Davis, William Hagen. Professor Hagen is the author of major works on German history in modern times. 6 years ago, he published one of his books exactly with such a title, and Choice Review of Books, a journal of American Library Association, called this book the outstanding academic work. His latest work is Anti-Jewish Violence in Poland, 1914-1920. It was published recently by Cambridge University Press. I have purchased digital edition of this work on Amazon and strongly recommend it. And strongly recommend it to anyone who would like to understand better situation not only 100 years ago, the subject of the book, but today, given the dramatic rise of the anti-Semitic feelings, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. Bill, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad that you found the time to be with us. Want to ask you a question before we proceed. Your major area of expertise is German modern history, right?
Well, actually, it's what we call Central Europe, or sometimes we call it Central Europe and East Central Europe. In all of my time in academia, I have been responsible for both German history and history of Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland, where I happen to know the language and have spent a lot of time over the years in archives and libraries researching things. And so, yeah, I'm kind of a German-Polish specialist who can deal with both sides of that equation. Not the equation, really.
How did you learn Polish language?
Well, there you are in Chicago, and once upon a time I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, having already studied and learned German at Harvard College. But when I came to Chicago for the PhD program, I had an opportunity to take some courses on Eastern Europe. There were some impressive exchange scholars from Eastern Europe, including a very wonderful man from Poland. And so I decided to take a plunge, see if I could handle the language, and I was young and motivated, and I sort of burned up the track, and then I got a nice fellowship to go to Poland, communist Poland, in late 1968, where I lived with my family for 16 months while I did research on a PhD dissertation that had to do with the part of old Poland that was incorporated or seized, partitioned by the Kingdom of Prussia. You could say the German part of partitioned Poland as opposed to the Russian or the Austrian part, and so the headquarters of that region were in the city of Poznan or Posen in German, and so I lived there, and I have a lot of experience in communist Poland and Eastern Europe generally. I know what it's like.
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I also know a little bit what it is like. Probably not as good as you do know, given that you worked with archival documents. Now, in 1968, many of the things that you have touched on in this book, the anti-Semitic violence in Poland, 1914-1920, were not available. I mean, it seems, at least as far as I know, most of the documents that currently available on the topic have become available only after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, I would say yes and no. This book of mine, I researched in New York City at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee's archive. I had to undergo a somewhat stringent interrogation before they let me into that archive. I think they didn't want any troublemakers. It's a private organization, but really wonderful sources on exactly this, World War I and its aftermath. And I also worked in Israel in the Central Zionist Archive, which is a great archive. And there's another one, the Central Archive for the History of the Jewish People, which is focused on Eastern Europe, and that was also good. And I worked in Vienna at the archives of the former Habsburg Empire. And in Poland, I can't say for sure what was exactly available and before 1989, but I can tell you that I was given full access to not only you might say the civil archives, of the government and its administrative organs, but the military archive was open to me with very liberally. So, I have nothing to complain about in that respect. Of course, it was different in the communist period, and I was limited as a young scholar to certain documents, but on the other hand, I was dealing with the period before World War I, so there weren't too many restrictions on that, if any. And but the attitude about Polish-Jewish relations was very, very cramped. It was very uncomfortable. And of course, 1968 was a time when a purge was going on in the Polish Communist Party of people who were accused of Zionism. And I myself can remember watching television, seeing the leader of the country, Gomułka, talk about the Zionist danger. So those were bad years for Polish-Jewish relations for sure. And I attended a farewell dinner party for the conductor of an orchestra who was leaving the country because of his Jewishness, and I was in the company of many Polish intellectuals, and it was a sad occasion. Everybody knew this was bad.
It was bad not only in 1968.
Well, I know that too.
It was bad also during the war, Second World War. It was also bad before the war, at least starting 1935. But even before that, that widespread anti-Jewish pogroms accompanied the rebirth of Polish statehood after World War I, that is 1918, and during Polish-Soviet War in 1920, is not a well-known thing.
You're right. In fact, there's no good book about it. This is the first. This is one of mine.
That is what exactly piqued my interest. And while the scholarship, on anti-Semitism stresses normally ideological inspiration of anti-Jewish violence, mostly by so-called patriotic intelligentsia, your book, which, as you said, based on archival sources and from 3 continents, deals more with the question of why people why people who were pogromers, that is, participated in the anti-Jewish violence, what was their motivation to take part in that violence and the things that they did.
Right. This is right, because in fact, the Polish authorities at the end of World War I and afterwards too, discouraged and condemned anti-Jewish violence. I mean, I found really no high-placed representatives of the government or even of the Catholic Church, which with its very ambiguous relationship to the Jewish presence. Leaders of even anti-Semitic political parties didn't want it to be happening at that time anyway, because it was a crucial moment for the restoration of Polish statehood. And they knew that anti-Jewish violence was a very unfavorable publicity for them. And nevertheless, it happened very widely. I mean, this book of mine enumerates or embraces some 275 incidents. You could call them riots, pogroms, plunder riots. There are different words that apply, and in terms of the loss of life, we're talking 400 to 600 people, probably several more hundreds who weren't counted. Now, if you compare that with the loss of life in Ukraine during the Russian Revolution at the very same time, or roughly the same time, I mean, the Polish casualties are way low, because in the Ukraine, I think scholars nowadays reckon on about 25,000 deaths, and some estimates go well above that. So that's a clue.
Are you saying 25,000 deaths in Ukrainian pogroms?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, the minimum is 38,000, and that was.
Well, there is controversy about the numbers. It's hard to quantify. I mean, I'm okay with 25 to 75 or even 100,000. But the point is really that the anti-Jewish collective violence in Poland was really not meant to be murderous, although some people got murdered, of course, and they were meant to be plunder riots from the point of view of a great many of the participants. And during the Polish-Soviet War, you could say that the soldiers had the conviction that they had a right to take anything they needed from any Jewish person. So some people resisted, of course, and they had guns and things happened. So, but really this book emphasizes the expressive nature of the anti-Jewish violence, the symbolic nature of it. And I think that's what's interesting about it, really, that when you look at grassroots violence committed by ordinary people, by peasants or villagers, farmers, call them what you like, commoners in the towns, artisans, workers, and petty bourgeois, people who got themselves involved in this violence. It's interesting to see that it so frequently took on a kind of theatrical form. For example, probably the most important example would be the cutting of beards, which was endemic in these Polish events, frequently by soldiers, but accompanied by big civilian crowds. And the Orthodox Jews, the Hasidic Jews, were, of course, the main victims here. And they were dragged out of their homes. People laughed and shouted, and sometimes they were made to dance around, and then they would cut the beard. And how do we interpret this? I mean, there are different ways to think about it. One of them is that, and there is some good evidence that people did feel this way, that the soldiers fighting for the New Poland and the people participating in the creation of the New Poland looked upon the Jewish presence as a kind of embarrassment. It was a medievalism. And also it was a way of signaling that the Polish lands weren't exclusively Polish. There was, in fact, this enormous Jewish presence. No other Christian people lived with a larger Jewish presence than the Poles did, which had its effect upon them psychologically, of course. But so in some senses, the beard cutting was a way of trying to say the traditional, the medieval Jewish presence is going to be removed. And of course, as you know, the Zionists in Poland, who were the real Jewish nationalists, generally did not wear long beards. they would shave entirely or just wear a very close beard, and they dressed in European dress, as it was said, and they spoke Polish. They were well educated in Polish, whereas the traditional Jews very often were not, especially the men. So
I understand it. One
the
question.
okay,
In your study, I mean, you've put many
yeah,
years in studying this. So I
right.
have two questions. One is why you decided to focus on this particular part of Jewish history in Poland. And second question I have, did you discover anything in the process that was a great surprise to you or shocked you or just made you say, wow, I did not know that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think to answer the second of your questions first, it did surprise me to see the vehemence of the violence, the cruelty of it, the enactment of the forced labor levies on the Jewish population, which was a kind of symbolic enslavement, really. We associate that very much with the Nazis, but here it is in full bloom, at this stage. And I would say just generally the radicalism of it all, and the prevalence in speech, not really in practice, but in speech, of ideas about mass murder, of slaughter. The word was used a lot, and some people would say, oh, they're just joking. Sometimes Jewish observers would discount it. They don't really mean that sort of thing, but it is there as a kind of discourse.
But at your University of Chicago, actually, it's my university too.
Is it? Good.
Well, Oriental Institute with Professor Gold.
Oh, good for you.
And I did not get PhD, unlike you.
Mm-hmm.
I just studied there at graduate.
Yeah, yeah.
But there was, I found in their archives that a leading representative of the Pilsudski's government already, Pilsudski, who was basically not as bad as National Democrats,
right?
Index.
Right.
He openly stated in presentation to Harvard University faculty that the only way to solve Jewish problem in Poland, and that is in 1919, slaughter all Jews.
Well, that never got back to Pilsudski, or he didn't report it to anybody.
Well, the people that were present there, according to the documents, just tried to quiet it down and just say, well, this is just cannot be. This is a joke. This is. But the guy was very serious.
Well, that wasn't the Pilsudskiite approach to the Jewish presence, though, and
not Pilsudski, but the Domsky. What's his name? The guy who was in charge.
Gamovsky.
Yeah, and all of the index, who they had it in mind very much so.
Well, actually, not so much, Alexander. I mean, they did condemn these pogroms through their major organs. There's a section in the book that deals with that, and but it was strategic. It was strategic in the sense that they didn't want anything to interfere with the restoration of a Polish state. They didn't want to have the minority treaty that accompanied, or the minority agreements that accompanied the Treaty of Versailles to be imposed on Poland. They thought that would, be an infringement of sovereignty and so on. But
the National Democratic Party started basically a war, let's say Cold War. You say no pogroms, Cold War, through boycotts of Jewish businesses 2 years previous to beginning of First World War.
Well, I know that, yeah. And that actually began even earlier in Prussian Poland. And the first book that I wrote having to do with German-Polish-Jewish relations under German rule down to 1914. The boycott issue began in the 1890s already. The index were getting strong in Prussian Poland. So that's another thing about this book of mine, is that many of the soldiers who were most prominent in the beard cutting and in other forms of humiliation of the Jewish population were recruited in the former German part of Poland, where they had undergone a kind of, along with the rest of the Germans, a sort of modernization, so that when they went into Russian and into Austrian Poland, they were very shocked, really, to see the huge presence of the traditional Jews. That was offensive to them. They often said so. They didn't want to die for these people, and so this beard cutting and other actions that they took, which are dealt with in the book, were an expression of a wish, really, to eliminate that presence, not with gun and knife, but in a more vague way, and that's, I talk about the cultural unconscious, because when collective violence occurred against the Jewish population, it wasn't as though people sat down and had a meeting and said, now what are we going to do? In a way, they knew already what they wanted to do, because it was culturally, they were acculturated to it over the centuries, modes of reviling Jewish people, of attacking them even, so it was all very spontaneous. It was all as if it was common sense. For example, why were people poor in World War I? Well, one big answer was the Jewish merchants are withholding goods to drive up the prices. They have no right to do that. We have a perfect right to plunder them, that kind of thing. And so that's why I emphasize what I call folk anti-Semitism as opposed to what I call print anti-Semitism. And I could say more about that, but why don't you go ahead?
So you're saying that during the work on this book, nothing really surprised you there, right? You did not discover anything that shocked you, huh?
Well, one thing that did shock me, I would say, is a proclamation that was that I found in the Polish military archive from 1920 during the Polish-Soviet War, signed by the commander of the army, really, General Sikorski, who, of course, was the leader of Poland in exile during World War II until his plane went down, and generally is regarded as one of the outstanding Poles of the 20th century. And he issued a proclamation to the peasantry, basically, of Poland to sharpen their axes and scythes and what else? I guess that was it, sickles, and to go out and hunt down the retreating Bolshevik soldiers, and if they wouldn't surrender, to slaughter them. And if they surrendered, of course, they would be taken prisoner. But of course, obviously, it was a license to kill. And, I found that was shocking.
Why was it shocking? I mean, there is a war. I mean, if he's talking about killing on soldiers of the retreating army, it's one thing.
But Mr. Alexander, in 1941 that Hitler issued what was called the Commissar Decree, in which he essentially gave free rein to his dreaded SS police units to murder the officers of the Red Army on the assumption that they were all Jewish Bolsheviks. And that was, in a way, the first order from Hitler himself concerning large-scale murder in Eastern Europe. So in a way, this decree of Sikorsky in 1920 is a kind of Commissar Decree because he very much says that the Red Army is led by Jewish commissars.
Mm-hmm.
So
the Poles have accepted the white Russian
yes.
opponents of communists, the idea that the communists who are in power now in Moscow and Petrograd are really Jews.
Or they're, puppets.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I
mean, that surprised me, I can say.
In the documents that I'm working now with, that were collected by and published in Moscow in the Book of Pogroms by Lydia Milakova. What is interesting about Polish pogroms in 1919, 1920 was that after every time they come and kill a bunch of Jews, they would try to find somebody who would give them a written attestation, a written document saying that Polish soldiers were not involved.
Well, I have to say, frankly, that I never discovered such a circumstance.
When we'll publish it, you will see it. And also, I want to ask you another question. You mentioned in your book that Purishkevich, the leader of the was also ethnic Pole.
Well,
the guy who in Russian history led the union of what is called Black Hundreds, Chernosoti, was an ethnic Pole. And there was another guy who was ethnic Pole. His name is Nikolai Yanushkevich, the chief of general staff of the Russian Army, Imperial Army.
Yeah.
And the guy whose documents, whose orders regarding being tough and killing Jews, we have in our possession.
I see. Well, of course. I mean, there were many. Isaac Deutscher wrote about the non-Jewish Jew, and there is the non-Polish Pole, so to speak. Especially many of the Poles who lived in the Russian Empire and, were Russified through the school system and other things. And so there's a vast zone of ambiguity between the Polish heartland, let's say between Warsaw and Moscow, where people of many ethnic origins made choices in their lives, to associate with one or another nationality that may not have even been their birth nationality. So it's not at all surprising. It doesn't really tell us anything that, that Purishkevich was of Polish parentage, because in his real life, he was a Russian.
Well, so was Yanushkevich. And in my mind, why I raised this issue is because it happened with Poles who were in Russia. It happened with Ukrainians who were in Russia. They were becoming more Russian than Russians.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
I see. Yeah, well, that's true. That is a phenomenon that you see, the zealous convert. Definitely.
But also there was another element, especially during the First World War. Russian army actually wanted to keep the Russian Poland as part of Russia. That was one of the major aims.
Yeah.
Plus add the Eastern Galicia to Russia as a part of what is now Ukraine.
Right.
Now, those were not the original aim of Russia during the First World War, but they have quickly become one of the, the first aim to keep Russia together was, of course, one of the big, maybe not stated, but real intentions of the Russian Tsar Nicholas, and including his Uncle Nikolai Nikolaevich, the supreme commander of the Russian army, and the major guy for our conversation, Nikolai Yanushkevich, that is the chief of staff, and the major organizer of Russian army anti-Jewish policy in East Galicia and Russian Poland. So now, because we're dealing with the same issue basically here, I mean, when you talk about, Poles, being extremely hostile and violent with regard.
Well, more. Remember, a great deal of the violence was symbolic. It was not murderous. It wasn't the same thing as Cossack violence, for example. That's important to understand, that there was a great deal of ritual humiliation. There was the sense that Poland, in being liberated from foreign rule and attaining its own new state, also had to liberate itself from the Jewish overlordship that so many people in Poland paranoiacally thought was bearing down on them. There was this notion that there was a peasant writer who put it very well. He said, in the 19th century, we overthrew the rule of the landed nobility, the Szlachta. We got rid of pańszczyzna. In other words, the unpaid labor obligations of the enserfed peasants. He said, now we have to overthrow the Żydowszczyzna, the rule of the Jews.
What year did he say it?
Well, this is in the early 20th century, but it's a widespread attitude that it's necessary to replace the Jewish merchants, to replace the Jewish tavern keepers with Christians. Okay, and eventually then, as the Russian Revolution takes place, another problem arises that they called Żydokomuna, the Jewish communist problem or overlordship, so it's very paranoid, it's very defensive, this Polish attitude that toward the Jewish presence, and there's this desire to assert themselves against it and above it, and that's what you see so much of in these acts of collective violence and that the book has to do with. So that's what the common people are doing, and I think in scholarship and in politics we have the tendency to think that ideology really rules the roost, or the interests of the ruling class. So it's very common to find studies of anti-Semitism that say, well, the anti-Semites had a clash of interest with the Jews, and they rationalize that clash of interest with anti-Semitism, with an ideology. And then they spread the ideology to the common folk, and the common folk, given certain signals, then would rise up and commit pogroms and that kind of thing. So that's really the standard view. But that's not what happens in this book at all. That isn't what happens. So you have to look at the motivation of the villagers and of the little people in the cities. You have to see it from below. That's why I emphasize what I call folk anti-Semitism and not print anti-Semitism. There's very little evidence that the common people in attacking Jewish communities or Jewish individuals were acting under the influence of printed ideology. They have their own notions about their relationship to the Jewish neighbors, you could say. And so this is really important to get down to that level of it. Historians aren't very good at it. Anthropologists are good at it, talking about popular culture, of the cultural unconscious, of what's in people's hearts and emotions that they're that they take for granted, that they think it's just common sense, or they don't even think about it at all. So,
And what is the significance of this fact that there is a grassroots, traditional, anti-Semitic hatred, not only in Poland, but in many other countries?
yes.
So
Okay, well, first of all,
what is the significance of it in your mind?
the anthropological studies, will certainly focus on what you call hatred, or what we can call hatred, but they also focus on the notion that ordinary people living in Eastern Europe, with its very large Jewish population, considered the Jews part of the world that was unchangeable. That they were there like the sky above us, like the trees in the forest. They were simply part of the world. And actually, in popular culture, the Jewish presence was frequently seen as having a beneficial side. Jews brought prosperity. They gave their children little piggy banks, in the form of religious Jews. And there's all kinds of ethnographic detail about this. And so the presence of the Jews could be good if everybody played the proper role. The presence of Jews could be bad if the balance between Christians and Jews got out of alignment.
And how do you explain this change of attitude? What I mean, you say that. What are the causes? What, in your mind, were the causes for the change of the attitude that led Poles to scream, "Kill the Jews"?
Well, they weren't really screaming, "Kill the Jews," but they were saying the Jews have gotten out of line. They're not playing the role that we expect them to play. And in World War I, of course, there were economic grievances that were very, very great among the Christian people. And they assumed things about the Jewish population that were completely false. I mean, I've got some evidence showing how, mobs would tear houses apart down to the last little nail. They would dig in the basement. The widespread belief that Jews always had wealth. It was hidden, but you could find it if you dug hard enough. The greatest diggers were the Cossacks. They knew how to do it. But everybody, anybody involved in this kind of anti-Jewish violence or plundering would be looking. They would go through the mattresses. They would tear the walls apart. It was fantastic. And, most of the victims of this anti-Jewish violence were not well-to-do people. The well-to-do Jews had ways of defending themselves. For one thing, they tended to live in the bigger cities where there was better police protection. They also had the ability to make payoffs to people, protection money. They knew how to, to sort of ensure themselves.
I'm not going to agree with you. I'm sorry on this one. Let's not forget 3,500 hostages that Russian army took during the 1914-1915, out of which 150 of them were shot or hanged. That is, hostages taken from rabbis and well-off Jews of the area.
Well, I know that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about grassroots attitudes.
So you're saying that the rich guy was able to save himself?
Very frequently. From Galicia, they went to Vienna. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Vienna during World War I who had fled Galicia. And, well, many of them were poor. Lots of them were in the middle and the upper middle class people who...
That is because they had money in order to leave.
Well, there were well-to-do Jews in these.
But when you're confronted with a pogromer, when you're dealing with people, that want to rob you while you're there, having money is not a plus. In fact, it's a minus.
Well, nonetheless, I have massive documentation about Jewish losses. And the losses that were suffered by well-to-do Jews were usually resulted from army confiscations. So, you know, people who had big textile operations, you know, who had big warehouses, the army would frequently just come in and truck it away, you know. And
there were at least half a, during, when you talk about the army, not about Poles, villagers and things like that, there was at least 500,000 deportees. That is, people that have been made homeless by the army, of which at least 50,000 died on the way.
On the Russian side, yes, I know that.
So
you know,
but that's why.
but that's not the topic.
Are you talking about Polish army after 1918?
And after, they didn't have an army until after 1918.
Well, that's what I mean. You know, so you're talking about when you say army, you're talking about Polish army, not Russian army, right?
Yes, yes. This is a book about Poles, not about Russians.
Okay, and you are
the Russians do figure in this, but still, it's about the Polish-Jewish relationship.
And when you say that it was Polish army that was doing the destruction, then you mean during the advance into Ukraine? That's when?
Well, in fighting over the city of Lviv or Lemberg, you know, they had to fight over that in 1918. That was a big pogrom, 1918, in after the Polish conquest of the city of Lviv.
So you're talking about that particular type of action on the part of new Polish army, right?
Well, and as they fought the war in 1920, as they pushed their front eastward. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I want to emphasize that if there is an importance in this book of mine, it has to do with popular culture. It has to do with grassroots attitudes. It's not a political history, although I give the necessary framing, and I have a lot of interesting stuff like that proclamation of Sikorski's and some statements by Pilsudski about the Jewish question that are not to be found in the standard literature, you know. But
so let's talk about this popular culture, because that popular culture has constantly been changing over a period of many years. You know, in 16th century in Poland, many Jews considered that was finally a heaven. You know, Poland, here is our settlement, you know. And even in 19th century, many Poles and Jews, when was the turning point in Jewish-Polish relations? 1898? When would you say?
Well, I wouldn't really identify that. I don't think that there was ever a moment when the Polish-Jewish relationship broke apart. It hasn't even broken apart today.
Really? You know, how's that? For me, as a Jew, Poland is nothing but a Jewish cemetery.
Well, that's a very common attitude, but you know, there's a very large Jewish community that is really interested in the Polish past. There are important societies and publications.
I am interested in Polish past, but so I'm interested in place of burial of my parents.
Well, I understand that, and you know, to the extent that I can, I commiserate. You know, I've certainly seen plenty of the evidence.
Am I interested in Poles as Poles? I'm not.
Yeah, well, I am. So there's that's the difference. But remember, there were lots of Jews who were interested in Poles as Poles.
Well, because Jews wanted to assimilate. Jews wanted to be accepted as Poles, and they did not find any way.
Some did, but the Zionists didn't really. The Zionists,
thank God,
were a powerful presence.
Yeah, thank God that there were Zionists, and most of Jews were Zionists, but there was no way out. Many Jews remained in Poland only to be killed.
Right. Well, that's right.
I mean,
But if it hadn't been for the German invasion, I think we can assume that over time, the Polish-Jewish relationship in Poland would have gotten better. It would have come more closely to resemble what we have here in the United States. The
really?
Jewish yes, in the interwar period,
Was it
yes,
the same way in, let's say, Hungary?
in the interwar period, the Jewish population was getting Polonized linguistically very fast.
So what? I mean, I speak
Never-
Ukrainian and I speak Russian, but I am a Jew. And there's
Well,
Jews
yeah,
remaining now in Ukraine or Russia.
well, right, but
And what you are describing as Polish part of
you have to
is the
you
same.
have you have to you have to share the majority language to be a part of a political culture. You know, in the United States, the English language is our greatest glue of national unity. And for the Jewish population of Poland to have been rapidly adopting the Polish language, not necessarily dropping Yiddish, no, but rapidly getting Polonized through the school system and through political life, parliamentary life. They had a very, a vigorous parliamentary and political life in interwar Poland.
In Germany, in Russia, what is Soviet Union, there was no more assimilating minority, acculturating minority than the Jews. It has absolutely no effect whatsoever on our acceptance in those societies. None.
Well, I don't.
The United States is different because the United States is a civic nation state, not ethnic nation state.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you in a general sense, but I think you will find many scholars, Jewish scholars, who deal with Poland who do not accept that the fate of the Jews in Poland was disaster. What they recognize is that the disaster came from Germany. And while certainly there was a great tension and between Polish Jews and Polish Christians in the 1930s, the attitude of the government in exile was certainly in favor of a kind of civic nation concept too, accepting, of course, that people are on the premise that people learned Polish and embraced the country, which a great many Jews did. Unfortunately, virtually all of them were murdered.
Yeah. And I have to say, once again, this is not the way to be a Pole. In Russia today, there's still many Jews that fully acculturated, intermarried, and on, all the way down to destruction of Jewish identity, although it's much better than under Soviet, during the Soviet period. And same thing in Ukraine, and same thing in many Eastern European countries. The remainers, the remaining Jews there, fully acculturated. And it seems like the hostility toward Jews, to remaining Jews in Eastern Europe today, is less than in Western Europe. But I have to say that your emphasis or your idea that if it wouldn't be for Germans, there wouldn't be problem for Jews in Poland, I disagree with, because Polish.
Of course, it's entirely hypothetical.
Right.
It's entirely hypothetical. There's no way to know.
Then why did you say it?
Well, I think it was probable. That's my reading of the situation. But probability is nothing more than probability.
But why? Why did you?
The Poles and the Jews could have come to terms with each other, and there are Jewish voices who say that too. For example, Marcus's book on the social and economic history of the Jews of Poland in the interwar period, very strong book. He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, and what is his thesis there?
Well, his thesis was that the Jewish presence economically was very strong in Poland, a very positive element in the Polish economy, that at that level, the Jewish world and the Polish worlds were weaving themselves together in the capitalist system. But of course, it was a world of depression too. So he wanted to emphasize that you had about 1 million people in Poland who were miserably poor. You had 1 million Jewish inhabitants of Poland who were hanging on by their fingernails, and you had 1 million who were in the comfortable middle and upper middle class. And so you can't really generalize about all 3 million of the Polish Jews. You have to recognize that there were classes among them and different experiences among them.
Anyway, so to finish
but
our...
that's not, again, that's not this book.
It's not this book, right? The book that I had a great interest, that is your book, you've just published, to me was very interesting because it's accumulation of incredible number of sources.
It's true, yes.
This is amazing, and it's almost 600-page book, and sources and citations constitute a big portion of this book. And for me, the interest specifically in that part of Jewish history, in that part of the world, is because the way I see it, the Second World War was the continuation of the First World War. Mm-hmm. During the First World War, the destruction of the Jewish people was the aim of the Tsarist Russia. And as a part...
Well, to an extent, I agree with you. Out in the Pale of Settlement, in the war zone, yes, but I don't think it was a war aimed to destroy the Jews of Russia, no. But they were very hard on.
It was not the war aim of civilian government, for sure, but it was the aim of the army. It was the aim of the general staff of the army. It was the aim of majority of its generals and officers. They wanted to destroy the Jewish people, and they did it within the area over which they had the charge, the command. That area was not only front line, it was 1,000 kilometers east of front line, reaching Podolia and reaching St. Petersburg. And in Poland, because
that's the front. Yes, that's the front.
Well, the front in 1915, during the retreat. But the front in 1914 was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Poland was then part of Russia. And in that Poland, the murder of Jews began the first day of the war.
Okay, well, I won't dispute your point about a Russian policy. That's not what my book is about.
And in talking, but for me, the interest in your book was that the Russian policy of aiming to destroy the Jews, not only in Russia. I mean, we have documents, it's going to be published in May, where the order goes directly, foreign Jews provide some comfort and food. Foreign non-Jews provide comfort and food, that is Galician Jews, Galician non-Jews, Gentiles, and foreign Jews concentration camps. The number of Jews killed by Russian army is incredible, and started it in Polish, what is today Polish territory. I mean, we're talking about what you mentioned it in your book too, Kurland and Kovno, and some parts of Belarus and Poland. Deportations, expulsions, and of course then in 1915 mass pogroms. You say by Cossacks, but it was not only by Cossacks. It was by regular army troops with active participation of Lithuanian villagers and Polish villagers.
Well, I know that. I know that.
So
Actually, there's some very good documentation of Russian pogroms and Ukrainian pogroms in this book, which I got at the archive in New York of the Joint Distribution Committee. So
yes,
the book is actually valuable for understanding what went on behind the Russian front, but it's not its main point.
Why did you think I spent money to purchase it?
That's a mystery to me, Mr. Alexander.
Alexander, it's Mr. Gendler, but it's Alexander. But I purchased it because it's a great book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I've enjoyed talking with you here. I'm wondering if there's anything else that I should. Let me just look at some notes I have here. I think it's very important that we ask ourselves, what is the popular cultural aspect of anti-Semitism? I think we see it today with these debates about.
You mean in general or in Poland?
Well, in general.
Okay.
Okay, we have this debate going on about Ilhan Omar in the American Congress and the remarks that she made. And my reading of that shows me that in our world, many people who want to talk about Israel don't have a sophisticated vocabulary to do so at all. And instead, they come up with these anti-Semitic traditions, talking about dual loyalty, for example. So in other words, people in our society have a big sort of baggage of prejudicial ideas and feelings about Jews. And when they start to talk about things like Israel, we don't hear, an intelligent discussion of the Israeli problem with the Palestinians or of Israeli politics. We hear things that are just old-fashioned stereotypes and anti-Semitic ideas and fears, So it's deep-rooted.
What is the reason for that? Bill, what is the reason for that?
Well, it's partly because we think, that the world really operates through a clash of rational interests, and we think that we see the political process from above, but actually we're all engaged in the political process as individuals with our own acculturation. There isn't a single American of Christian background who doesn't understand anti-Semitic thoughts and ideas. He will reject them in his heart and in his mind, but he knows about them. He knows about them because they're there.
He will reject in his heart and mind at this particular stage, so far.
Sorry?
He will reject, as you said, in his heart and mind, these ideas, anti-Semitic ideas, so far, at this particular time, some of them.
Well, we can't know what happens in the future, but I mean, generally speaking, the United States is not considered a hotbed of anti-Semitism, but the ideas, the old traditions are there. And, there are anthropologists who say it's part of the history of Christianity that all religions require an antagonist. There has to be some negative presence in any religion.
You mentioned this Muslim negative representative from Minnesota. She's Muslim.
Yeah. She's what?
She's Muslim. And today it seems like people like her want to use the anti-Semitism in order to create actually a bridge with blacks, with Latinas, with other Christians, white Christians in the United States, in order basically to destroy this country.
Well, that would be very difficult to prove. It's an idea, but I actually think that her motives are better than her language.
Really?
That's what I'm pointing to. That,
and I consider her motives to be much worse than her language. Her real motives are much worse.
Okay.
You need to read the presentation done by her protector, by her promoter, Keith Ellison, that he made to a Muslim group, and to see what are her motives, what are her real motives are.
Well, his motives and her motives are conceivably different.
He would not have made her representative from Minnesota if they were different.
Okay, well, I don't claim to be an expert about her and about these issues, but it does strike me that she cannot find a better language to talk about Israel than the language of popular anti-Semitism.
Are you calling her stupid?
Sorry?
Are you calling her stupid?
No, I'm saying that she's acculturated in such a way that she doesn't have an ability. And I think it's true of most Americans. You have these Republicans, who talk. Look, President Reagan talks very recklessly about Jews. So,
You
did I call him Reagan? I meant
Trump.
President Trump, of course.
Trump is not anti-Semite for any Jew who can see or think he is not whatsoever. But my question is not
President Trump, he has used anti-Semitic discourse.
Well, no.
He has, because that's my point, that everybody knows it.
A non-Jew who is comfortable with Jews sometimes can make jokes, seemingly at Jewish expense and seemingly with reference to some things. When you have Jewish grandchildren, you do not become anti-Semite.
Well, why don't we ask Dr. Freud?
Oh, Freud? I'm sorry. I'm not ready yet to go and ask him.
The specialist in the subconscious.
So this is very interesting. But once again, your book, I loved it, because it provides a lot of information. And for me, who is working now on the particular, that is the beginning of what I call Hurban, which is
I know the word.
Because
I know the word.
Hurban, 1914, 1922. There is 8-year destruction of Jews of Central and Eastern Europe by Poles, by Russians, by Ukrainians, by Lithuanians, by Romanians. That's the beginning of Holocaust. The Germans, the way I see it, changed their tune. Turning point, the way I see it, is 1916. That is when the German army decided to conduct the survey, similar to what was done by Russian army a year before that.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, that is a different thing. But in your book, what I really, really like is, as you say, a lot of collection of actual information about the motives and the situations in which actual people decide how to behave, what to do, and to join the mob or not to join.
Right.
By the way, you also mentioned in your book the diary of Anna
Kahan.
What did you think about it?
Great. Very impressive young woman.
Really? But
yes.
Nobody reads her diary.
Well, it's stuck away in an obscure source.
What is interesting in that diary for you?
Well, I mean, her eyewitness account of the early years of the war and the relations of the Jews and the Christians there in her hometown of Szydlce, there out in the eastern part of Poland. The discussions that go on within Jewish circles about Jewish identity among them. very interesting. She's a very mature young woman. Impressive.
Would you be willing to write the introduction to that book?
Well, I'd have to think about it. Maybe.
Sounds good. Anyway, Bill,
okay.
it was a
I appreciate this opportunity. It was nice of you to get in touch with me. So someday I'll be in Chicago and I'll drop into your Jewish cafe.
We would welcome you very, very, very much.
Great.
Anyway, as they say in China, sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Yeah.
Yeah, ich bin schon gesund. Yeah.
And be well.
Okay, Alexander. All right, you take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.